Ladies and gentlemen, to truly understand the South Sea Bubble of 1720, we must begin with the foundation of the company that started it all, the South Sea Company. Established in 1711, this company was not just another trading venture. It was an institution that promised immense wealth and economic prosperity for Britain. At the time, Britain was emerging as a global power, eager to expand its reach across the seas. The South Sea Company was granted a monopoly on trade with Spanish colonies in South America, a region believed to be filled with untapped riches. The mere idea of gaining access to this market was enough to ignite excitement among investors and politicians alike. People envisioned ships filled with gold, silver, exotic goods, and endless trading opportunities that would make Britain even more powerful and prosperous. However, there was a crucial problem. Spain controlled the South American territories, and relations between Britain and Spain were fragile, often marked by tension and conflict. The grand promises of trade were largely theoretical, as Spain was unlikely to allow Britain free access to its colonies. Despite this, the mere potential of trade in the region was enough to fuel immense speculation. What made the South Sea Company even more significant was its deep connection with the British government. It wasn't just a trading company, it was also involved in managing the national debt. At that time, Britain was dealing with financial difficulties, and the government saw the South Sea Company as a solution. The company proposed to take over a large portion of the national debt in exchange for issuing new shares to investors. This arrangement meant that the company's success became directly tied to the financial stability of the country. This setup created an illusion of credibility. If the government supported the South Sea Company, surely it had to be a safe and profitable venture. The public, seeing this government endorsement, felt even more confident in investing their money. Soon, everyone from wealthy aristocrats to middle-class workers wanted to buy shares in the company, believing it was their golden opportunity to become rich. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The company's directors and major stakeholders were less concerned with actual trade and more focused on inflating share prices. They knew that as long as they could keep public enthusiasm high, they could continue selling shares at increasing prices, reaping massive profits for themselves. Thus, the South Sea Company was born not as a successful trading enterprise, but as an elaborate financial scheme that would soon unravel in one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in history. One of the most powerful forces that drove the South Sea Bubble was the irresistible promise of wealth. The early 18th century was a time of growing ambition in Britain. The country was expanding its influence, and trade was seen as the ultimate path to riches. Ordinary people dreamed of prosperity, and the South Sea Company positioned itself as the gateway to financial success. The company claimed that it had exclusive trading rights with Spanish colonies in South America, a region thought to be overflowing with silver, gold, and exotic goods. The directors of the company painted a picture of endless opportunities, ships returning from across the Atlantic filled with treasure, British merchants striking lucrative deals, and investors reaping enormous profits from trade routes that would rival even those of the mighty East India Company. This vision was more than enough to ignite the imagination of the public. Stories spread about how investing in the company would bring life-changing fortunes. People believed they were not just purchasing shares, they were buying into a future of boundless riches. Many were convinced that Britain was on the verge of a new golden age, one that would make every investor wealthy beyond their dreams. The excitement was contagious. Aristocrats, businessmen, government officials, and even small shopkeepers rushed to buy shares, fearing they would miss out on this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It wasn't just seasoned investors who got involved. Ordinary citizens who had never participated in the stock market before took whatever savings they had and poured them into South Sea stock. Some even borrowed money to buy more shares, convinced that prices would only keep rising. The company's directors skillfully fed into this excitement. They made grand announcements about future profits, knowing full well that the mere expectation of wealth was enough to drive stock prices higher. Every time new shares were issued, they were snapped up within hours, often at inflated prices. The company also rewarded influential figures, including politicians and members of the royal court, with shares at discounted rates, ensuring their continued support and promotion of the scheme. As more and more people bought into the vision, the stock price skyrocketed. What had started as a simple business venture quickly turned into a national obsession. People saw their neighbors making money overnight and wanted in. It became a frenzy. Those who had never considered investing before suddenly felt they had to, or they would be left behind. But the reality was far different from the promises. Behind the scenes, the company had little actual trade. The profits that investors dreamed of were nothing more than speculation, built on confidence rather than substance. The illusion of guaranteed wealth was what kept the bubble growing, but as history has shown, no bubble can expand forever. One of the most significant reasons why the South Sea Company was able to gain such widespread trust and investment was its close relationship with the British government. Unlike an ordinary trading company, the South Sea Company was deeply intertwined with the nation's financial system, particularly its national debt. This connection gave it an air of legitimacy and stability that convinced thousands of people to invest, believing their money was safe. At the time, Britain was struggling with a massive national debt due to years of war, particularly the War of Spanish Succession. The government was desperate for a way to manage this debt, and the South Sea Company presented itself as the perfect solution. In 1719, the company proposed a bold plan. It would take over a significant portion of Britain's national debt in exchange for the exclusive right to sell company shares to the public. Essentially, investors who held government bonds would convert them into South Sea Company stock, believing they would receive much higher returns. This agreement was incredibly beneficial for the company. It meant that as long as people believed in its success, the company could continue selling shares and raising money. And because the British government was directly involved in the deal, the public saw it as a secure investment. After all, if the government supported it, how could it possibly fail? This illusion of security was one of the most dangerous aspects of the South Sea bubble. The company also had powerful allies within the government. Many high-ranking officials, including members of parliament and even the Chancellor of the Exchequer, held shares in the company. These individuals had a vested interest in keeping stock prices high, so they used their influence to promote the company and silence any doubts. Laws were even passed that favored the South Sea Company, preventing competition and reinforcing the belief that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This involvement went beyond financial policy. The company actively bribed politicians and gave them access to shares at discounted prices. In return, these officials publicly endorsed the company, further increasing public trust. The cycle was self-sustaining. As more people invested, stock prices rose, and as stock prices rose, more people wanted to invest. It became a national movement, with the government's implicit support fueling the fire. The illusion of government-backed security led to reckless speculation. People of all social classes, from wealthy aristocrats to small-time shopkeepers, believed they were making a risk-free investment. Many even took out loans to buy more shares, thinking that with the government involved, their fortunes were guaranteed. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. The government, while complicit, was not in full control of the company's activities. The South Sea Company's leadership was driven more by greed than by sound financial strategy. As stock prices soared beyond any reasonable value, even some within the government began to grow uneasy. Yet, at that point, so many officials were personally invested in the company's success that few dared to question it openly. The deeper the government became involved, the more dangerous the situation became. The entire economy was being inflated by a company that had little actual trade to support its claims. Investors, convinced that they were participating in a government-backed success story, continued pouring in their money. But as history has shown, the illusion of security is often the most dangerous illusion of all. One of the most dangerous and deceptive aspects of the South Sea bubble was the deliberate manipulation of stock prices by those in power. This was not just a case of natural market forces driving up demand. Rather, it was a carefully orchestrated effort by company insiders, politicians, and influential figures to inflate stock prices beyond any reasonable value. From the very beginning, the South Sea Company's leadership knew that the key to their success was maintaining public confidence. They understood that as long as people believed the company was making huge profits, they would continue to invest and stock prices would keep rising. The actual profitability of the company was secondary. What mattered most was the illusion of profitability. To achieve this, company directors and powerful insiders engaged in a series of tactics designed to manipulate the market. They spread exaggerated claims about the company's trade potential, suggesting that ships laden with gold, silver, and other valuable goods were soon to arrive from South America. These statements had little basis in reality, but the public believed them. Newspapers, often influenced by wealthy investors, published glowing reports about the South Sea Company's future, further fueling the frenzy. Another key tactic was insider trading. Those in positions of power, government officials, company directors, and wealthy investors, were given advance knowledge of financial decisions before they were made public. This allowed them to buy shares at lower prices and sell them at the peak of the bubble, reaping enormous profits. Ordinary investors, unaware of this manipulation, rushed in, believing they were investing in a company that was only going to keep growing. Additionally, the South Sea Company used bribery and corruption to maintain control. Politicians and influential figures were offered free or deeply discounted shares in exchange for their support. This meant that members of parliament, government officials, and even members of the royal court had a vested interest in keeping stock prices high. They spoke favorably about the company in public, encouraging more people to invest while secretly preparing to cash out before the inevitable collapse. To further manipulate prices, the company engaged in aggressive financial maneuvers. One of the most infamous strategies was the issuance of new shares at progressively higher prices. Each time the stock price rose, the company would issue more shares, claiming that demand was so high that they needed to expand. Investors saw this as a sign of growth and stability, leading to even more buying. But in reality, this was just a way to keep pumping money into the system without any real profits behind it. The company also encouraged borrowing to buy shares. Many investors, convinced that the stock price would only go up, took out massive loans to purchase shares. Banks and lenders, also caught up in the excitement, were more than willing to provide credit. This created a dangerous cycle. Rising stock prices led to more borrowing, which led to even higher stock prices. It was a classic case of a speculative bubble where prices were driven not by real value, but by blind optimism and artificial manipulation. Even as doubts about the company's actual trade operations began to surface, insiders worked hard to suppress negative news. Any criticism of the South Sea Company was dismissed as unfounded pessimism. Those who warned of potential risks were ridiculed or ignored, as the majority of investors remained caught up in the dream of unlimited wealth. The stock price kept climbing, and those at the top continued profiting at the expense of unsuspecting investors. However, as history has shown time and time again, no artificially inflated market can sustain itself forever. Eventually, the cracks in the illusion began to show, and the consequences of this massive manipulation would soon become impossible to hide. One of the most striking aspects of the South Sea bubble was the sheer intensity of public excitement surrounding the company. The promise of immense wealth, combined with government backing and relentless promotion, created a feverish rush to invest. What began as a financial opportunity for a select few quickly turned into a nationwide obsession as people from all walks of life scrambled to buy shares. At first, the excitement was largely confined to wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and government officials, those who had the financial means and connections to invest early. But as stock prices soared, word spread that the South Sea Company was creating fortunes overnight. The idea that an average person could become rich simply by purchasing shares became irresistible. Soon, not only the elite but also the middle and lower classes joined the frenzy. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, farmers, and even domestic servants scraped together whatever money they could to buy shares. Many sold their properties, businesses, or family heirlooms just to afford an investment. Some took out loans, convinced that the profits they would make would allow them to pay off their debts with ease. The belief that South Sea stock could only go up blinded people to the risks they were taking. The streets of London buzzed with excitement. Coffee houses, which were the financial hubs of the time, were packed with eager investors discussing the latest stock movements. Brokers and speculators worked tirelessly to secure more shares for their clients, while newspapers published sensational stories of individuals who had turned modest sums into vast fortunes. It seemed that everyone was making money, and no one wanted to be left behind. The frenzy reached such heights that people began investing in South Sea stock without understanding what the company even did. Many had no knowledge of trade, finance, or the stock market, but they believed in one simple idea. The South Sea Company was their ticket to wealth. The enthusiasm became so widespread that shares were being bought and sold at staggering prices, completely disconnected from the company's actual value or profitability. The mania also gave rise to a wave of imitation schemes. Seeing the public's insatiable hunger for investments, opportunists launched dozens of new companies promising extraordinary returns. Some of these ventures were legitimate, but many were outright fraudulent, designed solely to capitalize on the investment fever. There were schemes for everything from importing walrus oil to recovering sunken treasure, and yet, people eagerly poured their money into them, hoping to strike it rich. As more and more people invested, the demand for South Sea stock skyrocketed, and so did the price. Those who had bought shares early saw their wealth multiply in ways they had never imagined. The euphoria was intoxicating. People quit their jobs, believing they would never need to work again. Friends and family members urged each other to invest before it was too late. The idea that fortunes could be made effortlessly, simply by owning shares, became an accepted truth. But beneath this excitement, the foundations of the bubble were already crumbling. Many of those who were buying shares at extreme prices did not realize that their investments were based on speculation, not actual business success. The company's stock price had been driven not by real trade or earnings, but by public hysteria and the artificial inflation orchestrated by insiders. Yet, in the midst of the frenzy, no one wanted to acknowledge the risks. Everyone was too caught up in the dream of easy wealth, believing that the South Sea Company would continue to climb forever. While the South Sea Company presented itself as a powerful trading enterprise, the harsh truth was that it conducted very little actual trade. Despite the extravagant promises of wealth from South American markets, the company's business operations were largely an illusion. Investors were led to believe that British ships were sailing to distant lands, returning with gold, silver, and valuable goods, but in reality, very few such voyages ever took place. The South Sea Company had been granted a monopoly on trade with Spanish colonies in South America, but this monopoly was more theoretical than practical. Spain tightly controlled its colonial trade, and Britain had very limited access to these markets. The supposed vast trading opportunities were based on speculation rather than any concrete agreements or trade routes. Furthermore, Spain and Britain had a long history of conflict, and diplomatic tensions often prevented any meaningful trade from occurring. In reality, the company's most significant trade activity was not in goods, but in managing Britain's national debt. Instead of focusing on building a profitable trading operation, the South Sea Company's leaders were more interested in financial maneuvering. They created complex schemes to issue and resell company shares, inflating stock prices while doing little to establish real trade networks. The company's most notable trade venture was the Asiento Agreement, which gave Britain the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. Even this, however, was minimal. Over the course of its operations, the company transported only a small fraction of the slaves expected under the agreement, and the profits from these voyages were nowhere near what had been promised to investors. The reality was that the logistical challenges, competition from other trading companies, and restrictions from Spain made large-scale trade nearly impossible. Despite this, the company's leadership continued to present an image of success. They made vague but optimistic announcements about future trade, leading investors to believe that riches were just around the corner. Reports of successful shipments were exaggerated or outright fabricated. Maps and illustrations depicting British ships sailing to South America were published to maintain the illusion that a booming trade industry was underway. In truth, most of the company's income came from selling shares rather than from any trade profits. This lack of actual trade did not initially concern investors, as long as stock prices kept rising. Most shareholders were more focused on speculation. buying shares at a lower price and selling them for a profit, rather than the company's underlying business operations. As long as confidence remained high, people believed that the South Sea Company was thriving, even though its core business activities were almost non-existent. However, as more people began to scrutinize the company's lack of real trade, doubts began to spread. Some investors started to ask questions. Where were the goods? Where were the trading ships? Why were there no significant revenues from overseas trade? These concerns, once ignored in the frenzy of speculation, would soon become impossible to overlook. As the South Sea Company continued to expand its influence and manipulate stock prices, public enthusiasm reached its highest point. By early 1720, South Sea shares had climbed to astonishing levels, far beyond what any rational analysis of the company's trade prospects could justify. The stock, which had been selling at around £100 per share in early 1720, soared to over £1,000 within a matter of months. This dramatic rise created an illusion of unstoppable growth, convincing even more people to invest in what they believed was a guaranteed path to wealth. The mania surrounding the stock market was unlike anything Britain had ever seen. Wealthy aristocrats and high-ranking government officials had already made fortunes, but now, the opportunity to profit seemed open to everyone. Common workers, small merchants, and even servants desperately sought ways to buy shares. Many sold their homes, businesses, or family valuables to participate in what they saw as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to become rich. Banks and moneylenders eagerly provided loans to those who couldn't afford shares outright, further fueling the speculation. At the peak of the bubble, South Sea stock was not simply an investment. It had become a national obsession. Coffee houses, which functioned as informal stock exchange centers, were packed with excited investors discussing stock prices. Pamphlets and newspapers were filled with glowing reports about the company's bright future. Rumors spread that new trade agreements were about to be signed, that Spanish colonies would soon open their markets, and that the company's wealth would only continue to grow. The company's directors, aware that their fortunes depended on maintaining this enthusiasm, did everything they could to keep the bubble inflated. They continued issuing new shares at higher prices, further encouraging speculation. Many influential figures, including members of parliament and even members of the royal family, openly supported the company, reinforcing the belief that it was a safe and profitable investment. The directors also bribed journalists and public figures to publish positive reports about the company, ensuring that doubts and skepticism were drowned out by an overwhelming wave of optimism. During this time, extravagant displays of wealth became common. Those who had made money from the stock market flaunted their riches by purchasing grand estates, expensive clothing, and luxury goods. Stories spread of individuals who had started with modest investments and become incredibly wealthy in just a few months. These tales of rapid success only heightened the frenzy, as people feared missing out on what seemed like a golden opportunity. The speculative madness was not limited to the South Sea Company. Dozens of other companies, seeing the public's appetite for investing, sprang up overnight. Many of these ventures were fraudulent or entirely absurd, yet investors poured money into them without hesitation. Some of the most ridiculous schemes included companies claiming to develop new methods for extracting silver from lead, building perpetual motion machines, or even one infamous venture that openly admitted it was created for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Despite their dubious nature, these companies raised huge sums of money from an eager public. At this stage, the South Sea Company's stock price seemed invincible. No one wanted to believe that the value could ever go down. Those who voiced concerns were dismissed as pessimists or fools who did not understand the new era of wealth and opportunity. But beneath the surface, the cracks in the foundation were beginning to show. The rise in stock prices had been driven by speculation, not real economic growth, and the warning signs of an impending collapse were becoming harder to ignore. At the height of the South Sea bubble, it seemed as though nothing could stop the meteoric rise of the company's stock. Investors were blinded by the promise of wealth, and public confidence in the company remained strong. But beneath the surface, the financial system supporting this incredible surge was beginning to crack. As with all bubbles, there comes a point when speculation can no longer sustain itself, and reality starts to creep in. One of the first warning signs came when some of the most well-connected investors, those with inside knowledge of the company's financial health, began quietly selling their shares. These individuals, including government officials and South Sea Company directors, had seen firsthand that the company's supposed trade operations were not generating real profits. They knew that the astronomical stock prices were not sustainable and decided to cash out while they could still sell their shares at a high price. At first, these sell-offs were not widely noticed. With so many investors still eager to buy, the stock price continued to rise, and most people remained unaware that some of the wealthiest insiders were already taking their money and leaving. However, as more insiders began selling, stock prices fluctuated, causing some nervousness among the more observant traders. Then came the first major shock, a decline in stock prices. For months, the stock price had only gone in one direction, upward. Investors had grown accustomed to the idea that South Sea stock could never lose value. But when the first significant drop occurred, it sent a wave of unease through the market. At first, many dismissed it as a temporary dip, an opportunity to buy shares at a discount before the price inevitably soared again. However, the downward trend continued. More investors, sensing trouble, started selling off their shares. The problem with speculative bubbles is that their strength lies entirely in confidence. As soon as people begin to doubt the stability of the investment, the illusion starts to unravel. The South Sea Company had never been built on solid financial ground. It was a house of cards, propped up by hype and manipulation. Once people began to question its true value, the entire structure was at risk of collapse. Meanwhile, outside of the company itself, broader economic pressures were beginning to take effect. Many investors had borrowed heavily to buy South Sea stock, believing they would easily repay their loans once their shares increased in value. But as stock prices wavered, banks and moneylenders grew concerned. Some lenders began demanding repayment, forcing borrowers to sell their shares quickly to cover their debts. This rush to sell only added to the downward pressure on stock prices. News of these financial struggles began spreading. Reports surfaced that prominent investors had lost confidence in the company. Some newspapers, once filled with praise for the South Sea Company, started publishing cautious articles questioning the sustainability of the stock's high price. The same coffeehouses that had once been filled with eager investors celebrating their newfound wealth now buzzed with rumors and fears of an impending crash. At this point, the public began to realize that the South Sea Company had never delivered on its promises of vast trade profits. The long-hoped-for riches from South America had not materialized. The company's stock price had been inflated through speculation, insider trading, and market manipulation, not genuine economic success. What had seemed like a golden opportunity was now looking more and more like a dangerous trap. Despite attempts by the company's leadership to reassure investors, confidence continued to erode. More people began selling their shares, desperate to secure their money before prices fell further. The South Sea directors, seeing the storm brewing, scrambled to maintain stability. They issued statements, promising that the company's future remained bright. They even attempted to buy back shares themselves to keep prices from plummeting, but the damage had already begun. The initial cracks in the bubble were turning into fractures, and soon, the full collapse would be impossible to stop. As doubts about the South Sea Company's true value spread, the fragile illusion of endless prosperity began to shatter. The public, once blinded by dreams of wealth, started to recognize that the company's foundation was built not on trade, but on speculation and deception. With fear replacing greed, the market entered a dangerous phase, one where the slightest disruption could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. The first significant wave of panic came when large investors, many of whom had insider knowledge of the company's shaky financials, began selling off their shares in greater numbers. At first, the stock price dropped gradually, but as more investors followed suit, the decline accelerated. Those who had once been eager to buy South Sea stock at any price were now desperate to sell before their investments became worthless. Newspapers and pamphlets, which had previously been filled with praise for the company, now carried warnings and grim reports about the stock's decline. Rumors spread that the company's financial reserves were not as strong as claimed, that trade profits had been vastly exaggerated, and that key insiders had already abandoned ship. These reports sent shockwaves through the financial community, further deepening the panic. At the same time, banks and moneylenders, many of whom had loaned vast sums to investors, began calling in their debts. Throughout the mania, people had borrowed heavily to buy shares, believing that rising stock prices would make repayment easy. But now, as prices tumbled, these investors found themselves in a dire situation. Unable to sell their shares at a profit, many were forced to liquidate their holdings at a loss, leading to an even sharper decline in stock prices. The South Sea Company's leadership, aware of the growing crisis, tried to intervene. They attempted to stabilize prices by offering loans to struggling investors and buying back shares to artificially prop up demand. They made bold public statements, insisting that the company was still financially strong and that the stock would soon recover. But these desperate measures did little to restore confidence. By now, too many people had lost faith in the company's promises. In Parliament, the government, which had once eagerly supported the company, now found itself in an uncomfortable position. Many politicians had personally invested in South Sea stock, and their losses were mounting. Some had been bribed or had received shares at discounted prices, making them complicit in the bubble's creation. As the collapse intensified, Parliament came under immense pressure to take action. But what could they do? The financial disaster unfolding was too vast to be contained by simple reassurances. Across London, panic spread through the streets. Coffee houses, once filled with excited speculation, now buzzed with fear and outrage. Investors who had once dreamed of riches now faced financial ruin. Some had lost their life savings, their homes, and even their businesses. The stock, which had once soared past £1,000 per share, was now plummeting uncontrollably. As the collapse gained momentum, the entire financial system teetered on the brink. Many investors who had profited from the early days of the bubble had already cashed out, but countless others, ordinary people who had entered the market late, were left with nothing. The once celebrated South Sea Company, which had promised to bring untold wealth to Britain, was now at the center of one of the greatest financial disasters in history. And yet, the worst was still to come. As the South Sea Company's stock price continued to plummet, the initial wave of fear transformed into full-scale panic. What had once been a market driven by greed and boundless optimism was now dominated by desperation and disbelief. Investors who had poured their entire fortunes into South Sea stock watched helplessly as their wealth vanished before their eyes. The euphoria that had gripped London just months earlier was replaced by chaos, as thousands of people scrambled to sell their shares, only to find that no one was willing to buy them. For some, the realization of financial ruin came gradually, as each passing day brought news of further stock declines. For others, the moment was swift and devastating. One day they were wealthy, and the next, they had nothing. The collapse did not discriminate. It affected both the rich and the poor. Aristocrats who had boasted of their vast stock holdings now found themselves burdened with debts they could not repay. Small shopkeepers, blacksmiths, and laborers who had risked everything to invest were left destitute, unable to recover their lost savings. Banks and financial institutions that had loaned large sums to investors faced their own crisis. Many borrowers, having lost everything in the stock market, were unable to repay their debts. As defaults spread, banks faced insolvency, leading to widespread economic instability. Some banks collapsed entirely, taking with them the savings of thousands of depositors who had never even invested in South Sea stock. Those who had trusted financial institutions to protect their wealth suddenly found themselves penniless, victims of a disaster they had never seen coming. The panic spilled out into the streets. London's coffee houses, once centers of speculation and excitement, became gathering places for ruined investors, where desperate men and women shared their stories of loss and despair. Some tried to sell off whatever assets they had left, houses, jewelry, even family heirlooms, in a desperate attempt to recover something from the wreckage. Others, too ashamed to face their families, simply vanished from public life. For many, the emotional toll of the collapse was too much to bear. There were reports of suicides, as individuals who had once been among London's wealthiest citizens found themselves drowning in debt. Some South Sea investors, having lost everything, took their own lives, unable to cope with the shame and despair. The tragedy of the collapse was not just financial, it was deeply personal, affecting families, friendships, and livelihoods. The government, having once celebrated the South Sea Company as a financial miracle, now found itself in a dire situation. The crisis had spread far beyond the company itself. It had shaken the very foundation of the British economy. Parliament was inundated with petitions from ruined investors demanding justice, compensation, or intervention. The public, furious at the deception that had led to the bubble, demanded answers. Who was responsible for this catastrophe? How had such reckless speculation been allowed to happen? And most importantly, what could be done to stop the country from plunging into further economic ruin? Meanwhile, as ordinary people faced destitution, some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals, those who had orchestrated and benefited from the scheme, attempted to escape responsibility. Many of the company's directors had sold their shares at the peak of the bubble, making vast fortunes before the crash. These men, who had encouraged the public to invest, who had spread false promises of wealth, and who had manipulated the market for their own gain, were now seeking to protect themselves from the growing backlash. Across Britain, the anger was palpable. The country was not just dealing with an economic disaster, it was facing a crisis of trust. Faith in the financial system had been shattered. People who had once believed in the promise of investment and prosperity now saw the stock market as a dangerous trap, where only the most corrupt and well-connected could truly profit. The collapse of the South Sea bubble was not just a financial event, it was a national trauma, one that would leave lasting scars on British society. And yet, even as the full scale of the devastation became clear, the consequences were far from over. As the South Sea bubble collapsed, it became clear that Britain was not merely facing a financial disaster, it was grappling with a scandal of immense proportions. The collapse had wiped out the fortunes of thousands, from common workers to noble families, and left the entire nation in shock. But as the dust settled, one pressing question remained. Who was responsible for this catastrophe? How had such reckless speculation and deceit been allowed to thrive unchecked? Public outrage grew rapidly. The very same politicians, bankers, and businessmen who had once praised the South Sea Company and encouraged investment were now being exposed for their roles in the disaster. Many of these individuals had personally profited from the scheme, selling off their shares at peak prices while encouraging the public to keep buying. As more details emerged, it became evident that corruption, bribery, and fraud had played a central role in inflating the bubble. The people of Britain demanded justice, and Parliament had no choice but to respond. An official government inquiry was launched to investigate the causes of the collapse. The findings were damning. It was revealed that several high-ranking officials, including members of Parliament, government ministers, and even figures close to the monarchy, had been deeply involved in the scandal. Many of them had received large quantities of South Sea Company stock at artificially low prices in exchange for political favors and public endorsements of the company. In other words, the very people who were supposed to safeguard Britain's economy had instead used their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of ordinary citizens. As the inquiry progressed, the scale of corruption became even more shocking. Bribery had been rampant, with the company's directors using their immense wealth to influence politicians, silence critics, and manipulate stock prices. Some had even used their positions to spread false information about the company's financial health, convincing investors that South Sea stock was a secure and profitable investment when, in reality, it was built on empty promises. The revelations sparked an outpouring of public anger. Protests erupted across London, with crowds gathering outside Parliament to demand harsh punishments for those responsible. Newspapers printed scathing editorials condemning the corruption and calling for reforms to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. The financial elite, who had once been celebrated as visionaries and pioneers, were now vilified as criminals and thieves. In response to public pressure, Parliament took swift action. Several high-profile figures were arrested, and assets belonging to corrupt officials were seized. South Sea Company directors were stripped of their wealth, with some even being imprisoned for their roles in the scandal. However, for many ordinary investors, these punishments provided little comfort. Their savings were gone, their businesses ruined, and their futures uncertain. Justice, for many, came too late. But beyond the individual punishments, the collapse of the South Sea bubble forced Britain to confront a much deeper issue: the need for stricter financial regulation. The scandal had exposed the dangers of unchecked speculation, insider trading, and corporate fraud. It had shown how easily the financial system could be manipulated by those in power, and how devastating the consequences could be for the broader public. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the South Sea bubble was not merely the result of individual greed, but a symptom of a broken system, one that had allowed corruption to flourish and financial recklessness to go unchecked. The British government now faced an urgent challenge: to restore public trust and to ensure that such a disaster could never happen again. But even as Parliament debated new reforms, the damage had already been done. The scars left by the South Sea collapse would not fade quickly, and for many, the nightmare was far from over. The collapse of the South Sea bubble was not just a financial disaster, it was a political earthquake that shook the very foundations of Britain's government. The scandal had exposed widespread corruption, shattered public confidence in the nation's leaders, and left Parliament scrambling to contain the fallout. As the investigations into the debacle uncovered shocking levels of fraud and bribery, it became clear that this was not just the failure of a single company, but a systemic breakdown in governance and financial oversight. The public, already furious over their financial losses, now turned their anger toward the politicians and officials who had enabled the crisis. Many of these figures had not only promoted the South Sea Company, but had directly profited from its rise and collapse. Parliament was no longer seen as a guardian of the people's interests, but as a breeding ground for self-serving elites who had betrayed the nation's trust. Calls for resignations and legal actions against corrupt officials grew louder, with protests erupting in the streets of London and beyond. The political consequences were swift and severe. Several high-ranking officials, once considered untouchable, were forced to step down in disgrace. Among them were leading ministers who had personally benefited from South Sea stock sales and had used their influence to manipulate the market. Some were stripped of their positions, while others faced legal proceedings for their involvement in the scandal. The public demanded accountability, and Parliament was under immense pressure to deliver meaningful consequences for those responsible. The scandal also forced the British monarchy into an uncomfortable position. Although the Crown had not directly orchestrated the South Sea bubble, members of the royal family and their close advisors had been heavily involved in the speculation. The revelations of their financial entanglements fueled further outrage, forcing the monarchy to distance itself from the disgraced officials and to support measures aimed at restoring public confidence. One of the most significant political repercussions was the shift in power within Parliament. The ruling government, which had been closely linked to the South Sea Company, found itself losing credibility. Opposition politicians seized the moment, using the scandal as evidence of the ruling party's incompetence and corruption. The crisis reshaped the political landscape, weakening the influence of those who had supported the bubble while strengthening the position of reformers who demanded greater transparency and accountability. But beyond the resignations and political upheaval, the collapse of the South Sea Company sparked a broader conversation about the need for institutional reforms. The scandal had revealed dangerous flaws in Britain's financial system, flaws that, if left unaddressed, could lead to future economic crises. Parliament recognized that if it failed to act, public trust in the government and the stock market might never recover. In response, a series of financial and regulatory reforms were introduced. One of the most significant measures was the establishment of stricter oversight of financial markets. Laws were enacted to prevent companies from engaging in deceptive stock schemes, and stricter rules were imposed on how businesses could issue shares. The government also sought to impose greater transparency, ensuring that companies could no longer make exaggerated claims about their financial prospects without scrutiny. Furthermore, the scandal prompted discussions about the role of government in financial markets. Should the state intervene to prevent speculative bubbles from forming? Should it impose stricter regulations on banks and moneylenders? These debates would continue for years, shaping the evolution of financial policy in Britain. The collapse also led to a shift in the public's perception of investment. Where once there had been unbridled enthusiasm for stocks and speculation, now there was deep skepticism. Many who had lost everything in the bubble swore never to invest again, while others demanded that the government take a more active role in protecting investors from fraudulent schemes. Despite the reforms, however, the damage caused by the South Sea bubble could not be undone. The economic pain lingered for years, and for many Britons, the financial system remained a source of distrust. The political landscape had been reshaped, but the scars left by the crisis were far from healed. And yet, even as Britain sought to recover, the lessons of the South Sea scandal were not easily learned. The South Sea bubble was not just a momentary financial catastrophe. It left deep and lasting scars on Britain's economy, some of which persisted for decades. The speculative frenzy that had driven the stock prices to unimaginable heights was followed by a collapse so severe that it sent shockwaves through the entire financial system. While some individuals had profited handsomely from the scheme, thousands were left bankrupt, and the economic consequences rippled far beyond the initial investors. One of the most immediate effects was the destruction of personal wealth. The bubble had drawn in people from all walks of life, from aristocrats and government officials to small merchants, artisans, and laborers who had risked everything in pursuit of financial gain. When the crash came, many of these investors lost everything. Some had mortgaged their homes or borrowed heavily to buy shares, expecting prices to rise indefinitely. With the market's collapse, they found themselves in ruin, unable to repay debts and stripped of their financial security. For many, the economic devastation was more than just numbers on a ledger. It meant the loss of homes, businesses, and livelihoods. Small shopkeepers who had invested their life savings were forced to shut down. Families that had once lived comfortably found themselves plunged into poverty. The crisis had turned what had seemed like a golden opportunity into a widespread disaster, leaving countless Britons struggling to rebuild their financial stability. Beyond individual losses, the crash had far-reaching effects on the broader economy. Banks and financial institutions, which had extended massive loans to investors during the stock boom, found themselves in crisis as borrowers defaulted on their debts. Many banks faced insolvency, triggering a credit crunch that made it difficult for businesses to access capital. Without easy access to loans, economic activity slowed, and many industries experienced downturns. The effects were particularly severe in London, the heart of Britain's financial world. The city had been booming during the South Sea speculation, with money flowing freely and markets thriving. But after the collapse, confidence in the financial sector was shattered. Businesses that had relied on a steady influx of investment suddenly found themselves struggling to survive. Wealthy merchants and landowners, who had eagerly participated in the stock frenzy, now faced liquidity crises as their fortunes evaporated. The rapid contraction of wealth had a chilling effect on trade and commerce, leading to job losses and economic stagnation. The crisis also had a profound impact on Britain's international reputation as a financial powerhouse. Before the South Sea bubble, London had been emerging as one of Europe's most important financial centers. The collapse exposed the dangers of speculative excess and raised concerns about the stability of British markets. Foreign investors, who had previously seen Britain as a safe place to invest, now viewed its financial system with caution. For years after the crash, Britain had to work hard to rebuild trust and restore confidence in its economic stability. The economic fallout extended beyond Britain's borders as well. Many European investors had participated in the South Sea speculation, and the crash led to financial losses in countries such as France and the Netherlands. The interconnected nature of European finance meant that the bubble's burst sent ripples through international markets, contributing to economic uncertainty across the continent. At the same time, the British government found itself facing a new financial dilemma. The South Sea Company had originally been created to help manage the national debt, and now that the company was collapsing, the government had to step in to stabilize the situation. Parliament was forced to take measures to restructure the nation's debt, seeking ways to reassure creditors and prevent further economic damage. These efforts would shape Britain's financial policies for years to come. Perhaps one of the most lasting economic consequences of the South Sea bubble was the change in public attitudes toward investment. Before the bubble, there had been widespread enthusiasm for stocks and speculative ventures, with many believing that quick wealth was within easy reach. After the crash, a deep skepticism took hold. Investors became more cautious, wary of being caught in another speculative scheme. Many who had been burned by the South Sea disaster swore never to invest again, and for a long time, public participation in financial markets remained subdued. Despite the reforms that followed the crash, the damage to the economy could not be undone overnight. The South Sea bubble had been more than just a financial scandal. It had fundamentally altered Britain's economic landscape. Trust in the markets had been shattered, capital had been lost, and for many, the road to recovery was long and uncertain. Even as Britain sought to rebuild, the economic scars left by the South Sea collapse served as a stark warning of the dangers of unchecked speculation and financial greed. The collapse of the South Sea bubble did more than just destroy fortunes and shake political institutions. It left deep psychological and social wounds that lingered long after the immediate financial wreckage had been assessed. The boom and bust had played with human emotions on an unprecedented scale, turning hope into despair, trust into suspicion, and ambition into regret. While the economic and political consequences were severe, the personal toll on individuals and society at large was equally profound. Before the bubble burst, there had been a sense of euphoria across Britain. Ordinary people who had never before engaged in financial speculation found themselves caught up in a dream of limitless wealth. Investors spoke with excitement about their rising fortunes, neighbors boasted about their newfound prosperity, and even those who had never considered stock trading before were drawn in by the promise of easy riches. It was a period of mass optimism, where wealth seemed to materialize from nothing and success appeared within everyone's grasp. But when the collapse came, it was not just money that was lost, it was faith, confidence, and a sense of security. The psychological impact of sudden financial ruin was devastating. Many people who had staked their entire lives on South Sea stock were left in a state of shock, unable to comprehend how their fortunes had vanished overnight. Those who had built grand dreams of luxury and social advancement now faced the brutal reality of poverty and debt. The emotional turmoil was overwhelming for many, and despair took hold. Stories of personal tragedies became all too common. Some individuals, unable to cope with their losses, were driven to desperate actions. Suicides increased as once wealthy investors saw no way out of their financial ruin. Families were torn apart by the stress of lost fortunes. Husbands who had promised financial security to their wives and children were now beggars. Relationships strained under the weight of blame and regret. Once respected members of society were reduced to poverty, forced to sell their belongings or rely on charity to survive. The social fabric of Britain also suffered as trust in financial institutions and the upper classes eroded. Before the crash, many had believed that investing in the South Sea Company was a sign of intelligence and foresight. But after the collapse, those who had promoted the scheme, politicians, bankers, and company directors, were seen as villains. The working class, many of whom had suffered indirectly through lost jobs and economic downturns, viewed the wealthy elite with suspicion and resentment. There was a growing sense that the financial system was rigged in favor of the powerful, a sentiment that would linger for generations. The psychological effects extended beyond those directly involved in the bubble. The entire nation experienced a shift in attitude toward money, risk, and investment. The blind optimism that had characterized the South Sea mania gave way to deep caution, even paranoia, about financial ventures. Many people, once eager to invest, now swore never to risk their money in the stock market again. A generation of Britons who had witnessed the devastation firsthand carried a permanent distrust of speculative schemes, and this wariness was passed down to their children. Beyond individuals, the social atmosphere of Britain changed as well. Before the bubble, a culture of speculation and risk-taking had been encouraged, with even the most conservative members of society tempted by the promise of easy riches. But after the crash, a culture of financial conservatism took root. Many people chose to keep their wealth in tangible assets like land and gold rather than risk it in unpredictable markets. Business ventures, once fueled by ambition and speculation, became more measured and cautious. The spirit of economic adventure was replaced by a climate of fear. The South Sea disaster also reshaped attitudes toward the wealthy and powerful. The scandal had exposed deep corruption among the elite, and the public's trust in government officials, bankers, and financial advisors was severely damaged. The perception that those in power had used the bubble for their personal gain while leaving ordinary investors to suffer led to widespread resentment. In coffee houses and marketplaces, people no longer spoke of financial geniuses and market visionaries with admiration. Instead, they spoke with skepticism, questioning the motives of anyone who claimed to have a foolproof way to make money. This disillusionment had lasting effects on British society. The financial classes, once envied and respected, were now met with suspicion. The gap between the rich and the poor widened further, not just economically, but also in terms of trust and social cohesion. The crash had revealed how fragile the illusion of shared prosperity could be, and many ordinary people came to believe that the financial system was designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Even decades later, the psychological and social impact of the South Sea bubble lingered. The lessons learned from the disaster shaped how people viewed risk, investment, and the reliability of financial institutions. The fear of another collapse influenced economic behavior for years to come, making both investors and lawmakers more cautious. The memory of the South Sea bubble became a cautionary tale, a story passed down through generations as a reminder of what happens when greed overtakes reason, when speculation replaces substance, and when trust in financial institutions is misplaced. The damage, both personal and societal, had been done. And though Britain would eventually recover, the scars left by the collapse would never fully fade. The South Sea bubble of 1720 was more than just a financial crisis. It was a defining moment in economic history that left behind powerful lessons, many of which continue to shape financial markets and economic policies today. The collapse of the South Sea Company was a stark reminder of the dangers of speculation, the consequences of financial greed, and the devastating impact of unchecked corruption. The lessons drawn from this crisis not only influenced Britain's economic policies, but also provided guidance for future generations on the perils of financial bubbles. One of the most significant lessons was the recognition of how easily market speculation can spiral out of control when unchecked. Before the bubble burst, investors had convinced themselves that stock prices could only go up, driven by excitement, rumors, and a blind belief in endless prosperity. The South Sea Company stock was trading at prices that had no connection to its actual financial performance, yet people continued to buy, simply because they saw others doing the same. This speculative mania, fueled by the fear of missing out, created an illusion of stability that quickly crumbled when reality set in. The bubble exposed the psychological weaknesses of investors, their susceptibility to herd behavior, overconfidence, and the willingness to ignore warning signs in pursuit of wealth. The South Sea disaster also highlighted the dangers of corporate fraud and insider trading. The company's directors, along with politicians and bankers, had manipulated stock prices for their own gain, creating false confidence in the market. They spread misleading information, bribed officials, and took advantage of their positions to sell shares at inflated prices before the inevitable collapse. This scandal reinforced the need for financial regulations to prevent such abuses of power. In the aftermath of the crisis, Britain took steps to implement more transparency in financial markets, though it would take many more years before truly effective financial oversight was established. Another critical lesson was the importance of government responsibility in managing national economic stability. Before the bubble burst, the British government had been deeply involved in promoting the South Sea Company, treating it as a solution to national debt and encouraging citizens to invest. This entanglement between the state and private financial institutions created a dangerous conflict of interest. When the scheme collapsed, the government was forced to step in to restore order, proving that economic crises do not just affect private investors but can destabilize entire nations. The need for careful government oversight of financial markets became evident, influencing later economic policies not just in Britain, but across the world. The South Sea Bubble also played a crucial role in shaping financial law and regulation. In its wake, Britain introduced measures to prevent companies from engaging in similar fraudulent schemes. Some of these laws, like the Bubble Act of 1720, attempted to restrict the formation of joint stock companies without explicit government approval. While the Bubble Act itself was not entirely effective and was eventually repealed, it signaled a growing awareness that financial markets needed regulation to prevent reckless speculation and protect investors. Beyond legislation, the crisis changed public attitudes toward investment. Before the collapse, there had been widespread enthusiasm for stock markets, with people from all social classes eager to participate. But after the disaster, trust in financial markets was shattered. Investors became far more cautious, and financial conservatism took hold. People who had once been eager to speculate now viewed stocks with suspicion, preferring tangible assets such as land and gold over paper investments. This shift in mindset lasted for years, making it more difficult for companies to raise capital through stock offerings, as investors were reluctant to take risks. The South Sea disaster also became a historical reference point for future financial crises. Economists and policymakers have since studied the bubble to understand the recurring patterns of speculative booms and busts. The cycle of excessive optimism, overvaluation, panic, and collapse has been repeated throughout history, from the tulip mania of the 17th century to the stock market crash of 1929, and even the financial crises of the 21st century. The South Sea Bubble serves as a cautionary tale, reminding the world that financial markets, if left unchecked, can lead to devastating consequences. Importantly, the South Sea crisis also underscored the need for investor education. Many who invested in the company had little understanding of what they were buying, believing simply that stocks were a guaranteed path to wealth. This lack of financial literacy made it easy for fraudsters and speculators to manipulate the market. In the centuries since, efforts have been made in many countries to educate investors about the risks of speculation, the importance of diversification, and the need to research investments before committing funds. Even today, the South Sea Bubble remains a powerful symbol of financial recklessness. It is frequently referenced in discussions about economic bubbles, financial regulation, and investor behavior. It serves as a reminder that while financial markets can create wealth, they can also destroy it just as quickly when greed and speculation go unchecked. The lessons of the South Sea Bubble continue to influence modern financial practices, from stock market regulations to policies designed to prevent excessive risk-taking in banks and corporations. While Britain eventually recovered from the South Sea disaster, the impact of the crisis was felt for decades. The financial world had been changed forever, and the scars left by the collapse shaped economic thought for generations to come.